She walked onto that plane with 4 stripes on her sleeve, a federal badge in her pocket, and 6 years of evidence already saved to an encrypted drive. But the moment Captain Richard Hale saw her face, all he saw was someone he could remove. He had 31 years of seniority, a network of protected pilots, and an entire system quietly built to make sure people like him never faced consequences. What he didn't know was that the airline hadn't just assigned her to that cockpit. They had sent her there, and by the time he figured that out, it was already too late. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The gate agent's voice crackled through the terminal speakers at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. A smooth and rehearsed. Horizon Airways Flight 2247 to Chicago O'Hare is now boarding at Gate D14. All passengers, please have your boarding passes ready. It was 6:42 in the morning. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling terminal windows was still a deep, bruised purple, the kind that comes just before sunrise decides to commit. Coffee cups were being drained, rolling luggage was being yanked into line. Business travelers in pressed shirts were already on their phones, already annoyed, already somewhere else in their heads. Inside the cockpit of that Boeing 737, however, the morning had already turned hostile. Captain Richard Hale sat in the left seat, arms crossed, jaw set like concrete. He was a big man, late 50s, silver-haired, the kind of pilot who'd flown through thunderstorms over the Atlantic and never blinked. He had 31 years behind him, 31 years of authority built up layer by layer, like rings inside an old tree. And right now, every one of those rings was tightening. He was staring straight ahead at the instrument panel, not reading it, just staring. The pre-flight checklist sat untouched on the center console. Behind him, in the narrow corridor between the cockpit and the first-class cabin, 2 flight attendants moved quietly, loading beverage carts, checking overhead bins, pulling safety cards from seat pockets. They could feel the tension radiating from the cockpit, the way you feel heat coming off an engine that hasn't cooled down yet. They didn't look in. They kept moving. Then the cockpit door opened. Ava Brooks stepped inside. She was 32 years old, medium height, with the kind of posture that came from years of discipline, straight-backed, shoulders level, unhurried. She wore her Horizon Airways uniform the way it was designed to be worn. Crisp navy jacket, wings pinned exactly where they belonged, dark hair pulled back cleanly. She carried a flight bag over one shoulder and a tablet in her hand, already open to the pre-flight checklist. She glanced at the untouched checklist on the console, then at Hale. "Good morning, Captain," she said. Her voice was even, professional. Hale didn't look at her. "I'm not flying with her." He said it to no one in particular, to the windshield, to the instrument panel, as if she weren't standing 3 feet behind him. Ava didn't flinch. She set her flight bag down in the right seat and placed the tablet on the console, pulling her seatbelt across her lap with the same mechanical efficiency she always used. She'd heard those words before, not those exact words. Sometimes it was different packaging, but the message was always the same, and she had long since stopped letting it land the way it was intended to. She reached for the checklist. Hale finally turned. His eyes moved over her slowly, not the way someone looks at a colleague, but the way someone looks at an obstacle. "Did you hear me?" "I heard you," Ava said. She didn't look up from the checklist. "Hydraulic system check." "Put that down." She looked up then. Calm. Completely calm, like the surface of a lake on a windless morning. "We have a 6:58 pushback window, Captain. If we miss it..." "We go to the back of the line, and every passenger on this aircraft sits for another 40 minutes minimum." Hale leaned forward. "I don't care about the window. I care about who's sitting in that seat." The words dropped into the cockpit like stones. From the corridor, a flight attendant, young, maybe 25, with wide brown eyes and a name tag that read Lena, had stopped moving. She stood just outside the open cockpit door with a handful of safety cards pressed against her chest, listening. Hale's voice dropped lower, but didn't soften. We are responsible for 212 people on this aircraft. I've been flying this route for 11 years. I know this plane. I know this crew. He paused. This isn't a diversity experiment, not on my aircraft. The words were coded, carefully so. The kind of language that was designed to sound like concern, safety, responsibility, experience, while meaning something else entirely. Ava had heard that language before, too. The radio crackled. Ground control. Horizon 2247, what is your departure status? You are holding up D-14 exit lane. Hale reached for the radio. Ground, Horizon 2247, we are working through a crew issue. Copy that. 2247. You have approximately 9 minutes before we reassign your slot. He set the handset down and looked back at Ava. He seemed to be waiting for her to argue, to raise her voice, to give him something he could use. She gave him nothing. Then you're delaying the aircraft without cause, Ava said quietly. That will need to be documented. Hale's face tightened. I have every cause. I'm the captain. My signature clears this flight. Your signature clears this flight when pre-flight checks are complete and crew is ready to proceed. Right now, you've refused to begin checks, and you've made statements in front of crew members that constitute... That's enough. He cut her off. Potential grounds for a formal complaint, she finished, as if he hadn't spoken. Silence. In the cabin, passengers were filing in now, the soft shuffle of feet and the thunk of bags being lifted overhead. A businessman in an aisle seat was already pulling out his laptop. A woman in 4A was arranging a blanket over her lap. 2 kids near the back were already arguing over the window. And in seat 2B, a man in his early 50s sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, watching the closed cockpit door with quiet, focused attention. He had flown enough hours to know when something was wrong before it was announced. His name was Walter Drummond. He was a senior partner at a Chicago law firm. He would remember everything about this morning. Back in the cockpit, Hale had shifted in his seat. He was a man who understood leverage, or thought he did. He believed, genuinely believed, that if he applied enough pressure, this would resolve itself the way things had always resolved themselves. Someone would make a call. Someone would send a different Copilot. The problem would go away. He reached for his phone. I'm calling ops, he said. I want a replacement Copilot. Get someone else on this plane. Ava watched him dial. She said nothing, but her right hand moved almost imperceptibly to her jacket pocket, touching something there. A small, unsolid reassurance before returning to her lap. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. Something that wasn't anger and wasn't fear. It was a kind of quiet clarity, the kind that only comes when you've been expecting something for a long time and it finally arrives. From the corridor, Lena still hadn't moved. She watched Ava sitting in the co-pilot seat like she belonged there, because she did, and something shifted in Lena's chest. She'd been flying for Horizon for 2 years. She'd seen things she hadn't reported, said nothing when she probably should have, smiled when she'd wanted to do anything but. She slipped the safety cards back into their slot and moved away from the door. But she didn't go far. Hale got through to the operations manager, a man named Greg Parton, based in the D-Terminal Ops Center about 400 yards away. Hale kept his voice controlled, professional sounding. Greg, I need a co-pilot swap on 2247. I have concerns about the current assignment. A pause on the line. Captain Hale, your departure window is in 7 minutes. What kind of concerns? Concerns about readiness. Another pause, longer this time. Captain, First Officer Brooks has full clearance on the 737 series. Her certifications are current. I'm not following the issue. Hale's jaw tightened. I want a different co-pilot. That's not something I can authorize on 7 minutes' notice without documented cause, Captain. What I need from you is a status update. Are you pushing back or not? Hale set the phone down without answering. Oh, his face had gone a particular shade of red that Ava had seen on men like him before. The red that comes not from heat, but from the specific indignity of not getting what you want. He turned back to her. Your certifications, he said suddenly, loudly enough that the flight attendants in the corridor could hear. When were they last reviewed? Who signed off on your 737 type rating? Ava looked at him steadily. My certifications are on file with Horizon Airways HR, the FAA registry, and I carry hard copies in my flight bag. Would you like to review them? I'm asking you directly. And I answered you directly. The records exist. The process exists. She paused. What I'm not going to do is justify my presence in this cockpit to you. One of the flight attendants, not Lena, an older woman named Sheila, appeared at the cockpit door. She'd worked for Horizon for 19 years. She'd seen a lot. What she hadn't seen was a co-pilot sit this still under this kind of pressure. Captain Hale, Sheila said carefully, passengers are asking for departure updates. What should I tell them? Tell them we're working on it, Hale snapped, without looking at her. Sheila's eyes moved to Ava. Ava gave the smallest, almost invisible nod. It's okay. Go. Sheila went. Hale leaned toward Ava now, dropping his voice to something that was meant to feel like a threat. Either she gets off this flight, or I do. Ava looked at him for a long moment. She seemed to be measuring something. Not him exactly. Something else. Something larger. Then she said very quietly, Then, step out of the cockpit, Captain. The words landed like a flat stone on still water. Hale blinked. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was the smile of a man who has been told something absurd. The smile of someone who has never, not once in 31 years, been asked to step out of his own cockpit by a co-pilot young enough to be his daughter. I'm sorry, he said. Ava didn't repeat herself. She turned back to the checklist and picked up where she'd left off. Hale's smile faded. The radio crackled again. Ground control. The slot was disappearing. The passengers in the cabin were restless now. And somewhere in seat 2B, Walter Drummond had pulled out his own phone and was very quietly, very carefully, beginning to take notes. The minute hand on the cockpit clock moved, then moved again. The pushback window came and went. Ground control reassigned their slot, and Flight 2247 settled into the back of the departure queue like a car that had stalled in traffic, surrounded by movement, completely still. In the cabin, the announcement came through Sheila's practiced voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we do apologize for the slight delay. We'll have an update for you shortly. It was the word slight that bothered people. Because 40 minutes into sitting at a gate with the door sealed, there's nothing slight about it. Bags shifted, armrests were gripped. A man in row 12 flagged Lena down and asked, in the tone people use when they've already decided to be unreasonable, whether this was going to affect his connection. She gave him the scripted answer with a smile she'd trained herself to maintain and moved quickly back toward the front. Inside the cockpit, the Captain Richard Hale had found something close to an audience. The senior flight attendant from the forward galley, a man named Doug, broad-shouldered and 20 years into his Horizon career, had stopped by the cockpit door twice now. The second time, Hale had pulled him close and spoken quietly, the way men do when they want to appear like they're sharing information, but are really building a coalition. You've seen her before? Hale asked. Doug shook his head. That's my point, Hale said. Brand new face, no track record on this crew, and she walks in like she owns the place. Doug didn't say much, but he didn't walk away either. And that was enough. From her seat, Ava saw all of it. She continued working through the pre-flight checklist methodically, line by line, even though they weren't going anywhere yet. She cross-checked the hydraulic pressure readings. She ran the communication systems test. She reviewed the weather data for the Chicago corridor and noted a band of crosswind activity they'd need to account for above 28,000 feet. She logged all of it, every check, every timestamp, every system status. She documented it the way someone documents when they know the documentation is going to matter. Her handwriting in the margins of the checklist was small and precise. Outside the cockpit, in the cabin, Jordan Ellis had been watching the scene near the front with growing interest. He was a journalist, freelance aviation beat, working on a piece about airline staffing practices that had been in development for 3 months and hadn't found its angle yet. He'd boarded Flight 2247 for a completely routine trip to Chicago. He'd planned to use the flight time to revise a draft. Instead, he'd watched a senior flight attendant have a hushed conversation with a captain, then glance pointedly toward the cockpit, then look away. He'd noticed the absence of a pushback. He'd watched a second flight attendant, the young one, Lena, walk past his row 4 times in 20 minutes without actually doing anything. Jordan Ellis reached into his jacket pocket and turned on his phone's voice recorder. He placed the phone face down on the tray table in front of him. Then he opened his laptop and pretended to work. Back in the cockpit, Hale's phone rang again. This time, it wasn't ops. It was someone from the airline's senior executive team, a vice president named Gary Lester, calling from headquarters in Atlanta. Hale answered immediately. His posture changed slightly, straighter, more composed. "Captain Hale, this is Gary Lester. I need a status update on 2247. "Mr. Lester," Hale's voice was smooth, confident. "I have serious reservations about the crew composition on this flight. I've requested a reassignment that hasn't been addressed." A pause. "We're aware of the situation. I need you to tell me, is there a documented safety concern?" Hale glanced at Ava. "I have concerns about the first officer's experience level on this route." From across the console, without looking up, Ava said, "My route certifications and flight hours on the 737-800 are available in the system, Mr. Lester, including 12 confirmed flights on the Dallas-Chicago corridor in the last 4 months." Silence on the line. Hale's expression flickered. While he hadn't realized she could hear both sides of the call. "First Officer Brooks," Lester said carefully, "are you on this call?" "I'm in the cockpit, sir, so yes, I can hear." Another pause. "Captain Hale, I need you to clarify the nature of your concern. If there is no documented safety issue, we have a legal obligation issue developing here." "I am the captain of this aircraft," Hale said. "I have the right to flag crew concerns." "You have the right to flag documented crew concerns," Ava said quietly. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke the way someone speaks when they're reciting something they know by memory. Per Horizon Airways Operations Manual, Section 4, Subsection 12, a captain may request crew review under grounds of documented performance concern or certification verification. Neither has been filed. She paused. "What has been documented is a refusal to begin pre-flight checks and statements made in front of crew members that may constitute discriminatory conduct." The silence on the line this time was different, longer. Hale stared at her. Something in his face was shifting, not toward humility, toward something that looked more like recalculation. He'd expected resistance. He hadn't expected this. "Captain Hale," Lester said, his tone noticeably more measured now. "We need a decision. The aircraft has been grounded for 51 minutes. I need to know if we are proceeding." Hale said nothing. In the back of the plane, a woman was asking Lena if there was any way she could be rebooked. In row 4, Walter Drummond had stopped taking notes and was simply watching the forward cabin with the focused patience of a man who knew that the most important information comes when people stop performing. Lena moved through the cabin with the beverage cart, smiling, answering the same questions on a loop. But she wasn't really there. She was back in the cockpit in her mind, replaying the conversation she'd heard through the open door. This isn't a diversity experiment. She'd heard those words and had felt something tighten in her chest. Not just anger, but recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when something happens to someone else that you've also been quietly absorbing for years. She'd wanted to say something. She'd stood there with the safety cards against her chest and wanted desperately to say something and hadn't. Oh, she hated herself a little for that. Back in the cockpit, Hale had lowered his phone. Lester was still on the line. Ava had returned to her checklist and was reviewing navigation data. Chicago O'Hare runway configuration, current ATIS, expected traffic at arrival. As if this were all completely routine, as if she were simply waiting for the captain to catch up, which, in a way, she was. Hale watched her hands move across the tablet, watched her make a note, cross-reference something, make another note. And for the first time since she'd walked through that door, a different kind of feeling moved through him. Not quite unease, but close to it. "You think you're above this," he said. Not loudly, almost to himself. "I think we have 200 passengers waiting," Ava replied. "That's not what I meant." "I know." She didn't look up. "What you meant isn't my concern right now." He leaned back in his seat. "I've been flying since before you were born." "I know. I read your file." The words landed quietly, but they landed. Hale turned slowly. "What?" Ava said nothing else. She reached for the radio, checked the ground control frequency, and sat back, waiting. On the Lester call, which was still open, the line was silent. But someone on that end was listening to everything. And then, a flash. Not something that happened in the cockpit, but something that happened years before. A different cockpit, a different airport. Ava in the right seat of a training aircraft, mid-simulation, engine fire scenario running, her hands moving through the emergency checklist faster than anyone in the cohort. But her training officer, a retired Air Force captain named Marcus Webb, watching from the observer seat. Afterward, in the debriefing room, he'd said, "You're going to be exceptional, and that's going to be the problem." She'd asked him what he meant. He'd said, "You'll have to be twice as good, pass twice as many tests. Hold yourself twice as steady. And there are still going to be people in that cockpit who look at your face and decide they already know what you're worth." She'd listened. She'd nodded. And then she'd gone back to studying, back in the present, the cockpit, the stalled aircraft, the captain who had decided he already knew. Hale's phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen. His expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, a tightening around the eyes that might have meant nothing on another man. But on a man who'd spent 31 years never looking uncertain, it meant a great deal. He put the phone back in his pocket without answering. Then he turned to the ops frequency and did something Ava didn't expect. He questioned her certification, out loud, on a recorded channel. "Ground, Horizon 2247. Can you confirm the type rating status of first officer assigned to this flight? I want it verbally confirmed on record." Ground control paused. 2247. Say again. "I want verbal confirmation of the first officer's 737 type rating on this frequency." There was a longer pause from ground, the kind of pause that means someone is conferring with someone else. 2247. That information is on file with Horizon Ops. We don't typically... I'm requesting it, on record. Ava put down her tablet. She looked at Hale. Something in her expression was very still, the way things go very still just before something breaks. "Captain Hale," she said, "requesting certification confirmation over an open ATC frequency for a crew member without documented cause is a violation of Horizon Protocol and may constitute an FAA reportable event." He turned to her. "I'm the captain." "That doesn't make it legal." From the Lester call, still open on his phone on the console, a voice finally came through again. Firmer this time. "Captain Hale, stand down." Hale's hand went to the phone. "We need a decision," Lester said. "Now." The words sat in the cockpit like smoke. Hale looked at Ava. Ava looked back at him. The checklist was in her hand. Her wings caught the first gray light of morning coming through the windshield. "You'll have one," she said. It wasn't addressed to Lester. It was addressed to the situation itself, to the 53 minutes of delay, to the 200 passengers, to the man in the left seat who had made this about something it was never supposed to be about, and to the system that had quietly let men like him operate unchallenged for decades. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket, and her fingers closed around something there. The cockpit was quiet. Outside, the tarmac hummed with early morning activity. Fuel trucks moved, luggage carts beeped. A 777 taxied past on the adjacent lane, its engines a low, distant thunder. Hale watched her hand inside her jacket. Something about it made him go very still. The object Ava pulled from her jacket pocket was not what Richard Hale expected. It wasn't a phone. It wasn't a printed document. It was a badge, but not the standard Horizon Airways crew ID that every pilot and flight attendant wore clipped to their lapel. This one was different, smaller. Matte black casing with an embossed seal that Hale couldn't quite read from across the console. She held it for only a moment before returning it to her pocket, as if she'd simply needed to confirm it was there. But Hale had seen it, and something in his expression, not guilt, not yet, but something adjacent to it, moved across his face like a cloud crossing a patch of sunlight. He didn't say anything about the badge, not yet. He was a man who chose his moments, and this wasn't one he felt ready for. Instead, his phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen. This time he answered it on the second ring, turning slightly away from Ava as he did. His voice dropped into the low, controlled register he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "Yes." Ava heard one side of the conversation. She didn't need the other. She returned to her tablet and pulled up the aircraft's maintenance log for the last 48 hours. Routine checks, a replaced fuel sensor on the port engine, a recalibrated altimeter. All signed off, all clean. She cross-referenced the entries against the physical gauges in front of her, moving through each one with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times and never once treated it as routine. From outside the cockpit, Lena passed the door for the third time in 10 minutes. She wasn't doing anything in particular. Moving a cart, adjusting a bin latch, straightening a headrest cover. But she kept ending up near the front. She kept finding reasons to be within earshot of the cockpit door, which had drifted partially open again after Doug had leaned in to say something to Hale 20 minutes ago. She heard Hale say, "I don't care about the optics. I care about my crew." Then a pause. "No, I'm not backing down." Lena moved away, but the words followed her. The cabin had gone quiet in the way cabins go quiet when passengers have exhausted their outrage and settled into resignation. People were sleeping. People were watching downloaded shows with headphones on. A few were staring out the window at the tarmac with the blank, slightly defeated expression of people who have accepted that they are not in control of what happens next. Walter Drummond in seat 2B had finished his notes. He was now reading a brief on his tablet, but his eyes moved up every few minutes toward the closed cockpit door. He was a patient man. He'd spent 30 years in law learning that the most important thing you could do in any conflict was watch, wait, and remember everything. And then Ava's phone rang. Not her personal cell, not the cockpit radio. A separate device, smaller, dark-screened, that she'd kept in her flight bag. She looked at the screen, then looked at Hale's profile. He was still on his own call, still turned away. She answered. "Brooks." Her voice was quiet and flat, the way it gets when formality is required. The voice on the other end spoke for about 30 seconds. Ava listened without interrupting, without nodding, without any of the small automatic gestures people use to signal they're engaged. She just listened. Then she said, "Understood. I'll proceed from here." She ended the call and set the device back in her bag. Hale finished his own call a moment later. He turned back to the console, and for a moment the two of them simply existed in the same space. The gray Dallas morning pressing in through the windshield, the low hum of the auxiliary power unit beneath them, the distant sound of a gate agent's announcement in the terminal. "Who was that?" Hale asked. "Corporate," Ava said. "Lester?" "No." He watched her, waited for more. She didn't give him more. "Who then?" "Someone above Lester." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence that had come before. Previous silences in this cockpit had been Hale's. He'd owned them, filled them with implication, used them the way powerful men use silence, as a tool. This one belonged to something else entirely, something neither of them controlled. Hale set his phone on the console. He uncrossed his arms. "You think you can just override me? 31 years. I have 31 years on this airline." "I know," Ava said. "I have commendations, safety records. I've flown through conditions that would ground most." "I know, Captain Hale." She turned to look at him fully now. Her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't warm either. It was simply direct, the way a fact is direct. "I read your file, all of it." The second time she'd said that. The first time, he'd reacted with surprise. Now something else moved through his expression, something that took a moment to identify. It was recognition, not of a face. He'd never seen her face before this morning. He was almost certain of that. But of a name. He'd heard the name Brooke somewhere, in a context that he hadn't thought about in over a year. In a conversation he'd had with a colleague, a man named Patterson, Frank Patterson, a senior captain who'd been quietly removed from active duty 14 months ago following an internal review that had been, as far as Hale knew, confidential. Patterson had said something. After the review, he'd been angry, venting. He'd said, "Some auditor, young, sharp, dug into everything, wouldn't let anything go." Hale hadn't paid much attention at the time. Patterson's situation had seemed like a one-off. Internal politics. Now, in the low light of the cockpit with the morning just barely breaking outside, the name locked into place. Brooks. Hale's voice, when it came, was slightly different. Not softer exactly, but less certain. "You were involved in the Patterson review." Ava said nothing. That was a mishandled situation," Hale said. His tone had shifted almost imperceptibly into something that wanted to sound casual. "Frank was a good pilot. Good record." Frank Patterson had 3 dismissed complaints from female crew members over a 4-year period, Ava said quietly. His record was clean because someone kept cleaning it. Hale didn't respond to that. "He was connected to you?" Ava said. "Not as an accusation, as a statement of fact. You flew together for 8 years. You had mutual oversight on crew scheduling during that period." Hale's jaw tightened. "That's a stretch." "It might be," Ava said. "Or it might not." She turned back to her tablet. "Either way, it's documented." She wasn't performing. She wasn't angling for a reaction. She was simply stating what existed, what had already been written down, time-stamped, filed, and that, more than anything she'd said all morning, was what made Hale go very, very still. From the cabin, muffled through the thin partition wall, came the sound of a child asking when the plane was going to go. A parent's tired response, the soft percussion of normal human impatience. Hale's voice rose without warning, not shouting, not quite, but loud enough that Doug, who had just appeared at the corridor end again, took a step back. "You think you can just walk into my cockpit and start rewriting history? Based on what?" Someone's complaint file. I've given this airline 3 decades. Captain Hale. Ava's voice didn't rise, not even slightly. Lower your voice. He stopped, not because she'd commanded it, but because she had said it so calmly, so completely without alarm, that raising his voice further would have made him look exactly like what he was becoming, a man who had run out of logic and was operating on volume alone. He lowered his voice. "You're not going to win this," he said quietly. "I'm not trying to win anything," she replied. "I'm doing my job." She continued documenting, methodically, line by line. Outside, on the tarmac, a fuel truck had stopped near the aircraft. 2 ground crew members in orange vests stood beside it, waiting. The plane wasn't going anywhere, and they all knew it. Inside, in row 7, Jordan Ellis had shifted in his seat. He was reading something on his phone now, a series of push notifications from a news aggregator he'd set up 2 years ago to flag airline-related stories. One of them had just pinged. Not about this flight, not yet. But about Horizon Airways generally, a brief item from a regional outlet noting that Flight 2247 out of Dallas had been grounded for over an hour with no public explanation. Someone at the gate had posted a photo of the aircraft sitting motionless with its jetway still attached. The caption read, "Anyone know what's happening on this flight?" It had 43 shares. Jordan closed the notification. He looked at his recorder, still running on the tray table. He looked at the cockpit door. Then he looked back at his phone and began drafting a quiet message to his editor. In the cockpit, Ava had reached the end of the pre-flight checklist. She set the tablet down and sat back in her seat, hands resting loosely in her lap. In the contrast between her stillness and the gathering chaos, the social media murmur, the restless cabin, the executive call still processing somewhere in Atlanta, was almost complete. She looked at the instrument panel, then at the windshield, then, almost as an afterthought, at Hale. "Captain Hale," she said, "step out. This is your last opportunity." It was the second time she'd said it. The first time he'd laughed. This time he didn't laugh. He opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes moved to her jacket pocket, to where the badge was, and then back to her face. "What exactly are you?" he said. The question came out differently than he'd intended, less like a challenge, more like a genuine question from a man who had just realized he didn't know the answer. Ava reached into her jacket pocket. She removed the badge. She placed it on the console between them, face up. Hale looked at it. His expression changed for the first time that morning. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, with a sharp intake of breath and wide eyes. It was quieter than that, a slow, almost geological shift, like watching a rock face realize it is standing on the edge of something much higher than it thought. The badge didn't belong to Horizon Airways, it belonged to something else entirely. The seal on the badge read Federal Aviation Safety Authority, Internal Compliance Division. Below the seal, in smaller text, Senior Auditor, Undercover Operations. And below that, her name, her real title, the one that had nothing to do with the co-pilot seat she'd been sitting in for the past hour and 17 minutes. Hale stared at it for a long moment. The kind of moment that feels longer than it is because everything inside it is being rapidly reassembled. He had spent his entire career understanding the hierarchy of a cockpit. Captain at the top, first officer below, crew below that, ground ops feeding in from the outside. Executives above all of it, but distant. Voices on a phone, names on memos. The hierarchy was clear. It was the one thing in 31 years that had never wavered. And now it was sitting on the console between him and a woman he had dismissed within the first 10 seconds of meeting her, and it was telling him something he did not want to accept. She wasn't below him in any hierarchy that mattered. She'd never been below him. "You're an auditor," he said. His voice was flat, not quite believing it yet. "Senior auditor," Ava said. "Embedded operations." I've been placed on selected Horizon flights for the past 4 months as part of a formal compliance review. She picked the badge up and returned it to her pocket. This flight was on the list. You were not flagged specifically. The route was. But you've made this significantly easier to document. Hale didn't move. The entire interaction since you refused pre-flight checks has been logged, Ava continued. Your statements in front of crew members, your request on the ATC frequency, your phone calls, the crew behavior in the corridor. She paused. All of it. From the corridor, Doug had gone very still. He was standing just beyond the door, and he'd heard enough. His face had gone the particular pale that comes when a person realizes they've been performing for an audience they didn't know was there. Sheila. He, further back in the galley, heard the shift in the cockpit's tone without being able to make out the words. She straightened up from what she was doing and tilted her head slightly, listening. And Lena, at the back of the forward cabin, had stopped completely. She was holding a small stack of napkins against her chest, and she was staring at the floor, but she wasn't seeing the floor. She was seeing every moment since Ava had walked through the cockpit door. Every word, every silence. Every time she'd stood near that door and done nothing. Her hands tightened around the napkins. In the cockpit, Hale found his voice again. It was different now. Stripped of the authority it had carried all morning, operating on something rawer and less certain. This is, you can't just, I have rights. Crew has rights. You can't conduct a covert operation and then use it as, the Federal Aviation Safety Authority has full jurisdiction to conduct embedded compliance reviews, Ava said. It's outlined in the regulatory framework you agreed to when you accepted your certification. You've agreed to it every year at renewal. She looked at him calmly. Would you like me to cite the specific section? He wouldn't. Ava reached for the communications panel. She switched to the operations frequency and spoke clearly, precisely. Operations, this is First Officer Brooks on Horizon 2-247. I am formally notifying you that this aircraft is now under audit authority per FASA Compliance Protocol 7-Delta. Ground crew should hold position. No departure clearance to be requested until further notice. A pause from operations. Then, copy that, 2247. Holding. The words landed in the cockpit like a door closing. Hale's arrogance, that decades-thick layer of it, didn't shatter. It cracked, slowly, visibly, the way old things crack when pressure finally finds the right angle. He said, You're destroying careers. Over one morning. Over a pattern, Ava said quietly. One morning is just where the pattern became impossible to ignore. She reached for her tablet and opened a new document. Not the pre-flight checklist this time, something else, a formal incident report, pre-formatted, with fields for date, flight number, crew identification, nature of incident, witnesses present, and a long blank space labeled Detailed Account. She began typing. From the cabin, Sheila appeared at the cockpit door. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes were scanning the space quickly. Hale in the left seat, posture collapsed slightly inward. Ava in the right seat, writing. The pre-flight checklist sitting completed on the console. First Officer Brooks, Sheila said carefully. What should I tell the passengers? Tell them we'll have a departure update within 15 minutes, Ava said without looking up. And, Sheila, I'd like you to stay available. I'll need a brief conversation with each crew member individually in the next 30 minutes. Sheila blinked. Each crew member? Yes. Sheila looked at Hale. Hale said nothing. She looked back at Ava. Of course. She withdrew. Back in the cabin, the announcement came through. 15 minutes, departure update. A collective exhale of cautious relief from the passengers who had been holding their frustration at a low, careful simmer. Walter Drummond in 2B put his brief away and folded his hands in his lap. 15 minutes. He'd been in enough high-stakes rooms to know that the most consequential things usually happened in the 15 minutes people were told to wait. Jordan Ellis checked his recorder. Still running. He glanced at the cockpit door, which had swung mostly closed again. Then he looked at his phone. The post about the grounded flight had 43 shares when he'd last checked. It had 211 now. He started typing faster. In the cockpit, Ava had paused her report. She looked at Hale, who had not moved from the left seat. His hands were on his knees. He was staring at the instrument panel with the expression of a man trying to decide something. "Captain Hale," she said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was final. "You are relieved of duty on this flight." The words came out evenly, without theater, without the satisfaction that a lesser person might have let creep in after everything that had happened in the past hour and 20 minutes. They came out the way a conclusion comes out, not as a judgment on the man, but as the only logical result of every choice he had made since she'd walked through that door. Hale didn't respond immediately. Then, quietly, "You can't fly this aircraft alone." "I know," Ava said. "Operations will arrange a replacement captain. In the meantime, I will remain in this cockpit as the acting authority under FASA protocol." She paused. "You're welcome to remain in the terminal, or you can wait in the airline operations office. Either way, you will not be reboarding this aircraft." Hale stood slowly. He was a big man. And standing up in a cockpit was always slightly awkward. The ceiling low, the space narrow. But he managed it with the careful dignity of someone who has decided that dignity is the last thing they have left to protect. He looked at Ava one more time. She was already back to her report. He picked up his flight bag from behind the seat. He straightened his jacket, and then he moved to the cockpit door, opened it, and stepped out into the corridor. Doug was standing there. For a moment, the two men looked at each other. Doug had 20 years on the airline. He'd quietly sided with Hale this morning, not loudly, not formally, but in the small ways that add up. The leaning in, the nodding, the shared glances. Now he looked at Hale's face and saw something he hadn't expected to see there. Fear. Hale moved past him without speaking. Sheila watched from the galley entrance as Hale walked through the first-class cabin toward the jetway door. Several passengers looked up. Walter Drummond watched him pass with an expression that revealed nothing at all. A gate agent outside pulled the jetway door open. Hale stepped through. The door closed behind him. In the cockpit, Ava set down her tablet. She sat for a moment in the quiet, the first real quiet since she'd stepped aboard. Outside, a thin line of gold was appearing along the eastern edge of the tarmac. The sun was finally committing. She looked at the left seat. Empty now. Instrument panel humming softly. The pre-flight checklist completed and waiting. She picked up her communications device and made a call. "It's Brooks. Hale has been removed. I'm proceeding with full incident documentation." A pause. No, it doesn't stop with him. She looked at the cockpit door. On the other side of it, 212 passengers were rearranging their expectations of the morning. A flight attendant was making a quiet announcement. Somewhere in the cabin, a child had finally fallen asleep. And somewhere in that cabin, a journalist was writing, and a lawyer was watching. And a young flight attendant named Lena was standing near the forward galley with her hands no longer shaking, coming to a decision about what she was going to do next. Ava opened a second document on her tablet. She titled it, Supplementary Review, Horizon Airways Operating Culture, Dallas Hub. She began with a section heading, Crew Conduct. Below it, she typed the first name, then the second, then the third. She didn't rush. She had time now. The aircraft wasn't going anywhere until she said so, and she had a great deal left to document. From the cabin, she heard Sheila's voice, professional, measured, telling passengers that there would be a brief crew adjustment and that the airline appreciated their continued patience. Brief crew adjustment. Ava almost smiled. Then she typed the fourth name. She looked up once, through the windshield, at the wide expanse of tarmac stretching toward the runway. The same runway she'd be cleared to use in about 40 minutes, once operations sent a replacement captain and the necessary paperwork had been processed. She'd flown into Dallas 100 times. She knew what the takeoff looked like from the right seat. The city falling away, the flat Texas landscape opening up below, the horizon clarifying as altitude increased. She'd be doing her job from that seat in under an hour. That had never been in question. What was in question, what was now very firmly in the process of being resolved, was everything that happened on the ground. The invisible machinery that had allowed a man like Richard Hale to sit in a cockpit for 31 years and treat his authority like a personal possession. The culture that had allowed complaints to be dismissed, patterns to be ignored, documentation to disappear. The machinery that someone, somewhere above the level of Gary Lester, had been oiling for a very long time. Ava thought about that, about what she'd found in the internal logs 3 weeks ago, before this flight had even been assigned, about the scheduling patterns, the dismissed reports, the names that kept appearing in proximity to problems that somehow never became formal investigations. She thought about what she'd said on the phone just minutes ago. It doesn't stop with him. She typed the 5th name, then she paused, fingers over the keyboard, and looked at the empty left seat one more time. Richard Hale had sat in that seat for 11 years on this route. He had assumed, genuinely, completely assumed, that the woman who walked through the cockpit door this morning was something he could remove, something the system would protect him from, something that, in the quiet machinery of airline hierarchy and institutional habit, would simply go away. He hadn't considered the possibility that the system had sent her. Ava looked back at her tablet. She typed the 6th name. The cockpit was quiet in the way that only happens after something large has moved through a space and left it permanently changed. Ava sat in the right seat with her tablet open, her 6th entry typed, her hands steady. The auxiliary power unit hummed beneath the floor. Outside, the Dallas morning had fully arrived. Pale gold light spreading flat across the tarmac, casting long shadows from the fuel trucks and the equipment carts that had been sitting idle for the better part of 2 hours. Operations had confirmed a replacement captain was en route from the terminal. ETA, 20 minutes. 20 minutes was enough time to do a great deal. Ava saved her incident report and opened the aircraft's internal operations log, the kind that ran in the background on every commercial flight, time-stamping every communication, every system check, every deviation from standard protocol. She'd requested remote access to the expanded version through FASA's compliance portal 40 minutes ago. The authorization had just come through. She began reading. The log wasn't just for this flight. The access level she'd been granted pulled data across the Dallas hub, crew scheduling records, maintenance flags, internal communication threads, complaint submissions, and their dispositions. It was the kind of data that, read in isolation, looked like routine airline administration. Read in sequence, with the right context, it told a different story entirely. Complaints submitted, complaints marked as resolved, complaints closed without investigation. A pattern so consistent it stopped looking like oversight and started looking like a decision. Ava leaned forward slightly. Her eyes moved across the screen. She pulled a specific thread. Crew complaint submissions from the Dallas hub over the past 3 years. 41 submissions. 37 marked closed. Of the 37, 22 had been closed within 48 hours of submission, with a note that read, in various forms, the same thing. Matter reviewed. No further action required. 22 complaints. Closed in 48 hours. No documented review process. No interviews logged. No follow-up communications on file. Signed off, every single one, by the same operations coordinator. Ava wrote the name down. Then she cross-referenced it against the crew scheduling records. The coordinator, a man named Brian Coulter, had been in the Dallas hub for 7 years. His scheduling history showed a consistent pattern. Certain senior pilots clustered onto certain routes, certain junior crew members rotated away from those routes after filing complaints, and a specific group of pilots, 11 names, who had never once in 7 years been formally reviewed, despite accumulating between them a total of 31 complaint filings. Richard Hale's name was on the list. His complaint count, 6, all closed, all within 48 hours. Frank Patterson's name was also on the list. His count, 5, closed, gone. Ava wrote Coulter's name in her supplementary review document. Then she went back to the data. She was still reading when the cockpit door opened. It was Sheila. First Officer Brooks. Sheila paused, then, carefully, "Lena would like to speak with you." She says it can't wait." Ava looked up. "Send her in." Sheila withdrew. A moment later, Lena appeared in the cockpit doorway. She was 25 years old, and she looked younger than that right now, standing with her hands clasped in front of her and her jaw set in the particular way of someone who has made a decision they know is going to cost something. "Close the door," Ava said gently. Lena closed it. She stood in the narrow space behind the 2 seats, the jump seat folded against the wall beside her. "Sit," Ava said. Lena sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the APU filled the silence. "I should have said something earlier," Lena said finally. Her voice was controlled, but barely. "When he said what he said, I was standing right there, and I didn't." "I know," Ava said. "It's okay." "It's not. Though." Lena looked at her hands. "It's not the first time I've done that, stood there and said nothing." She exhaled slowly. "Captain Hale, he said something, about 8 months ago, to one of the other attendants. Maya. Something inappropriate. About how she got hired. She reported it." Lena paused. Nothing happened. Ava was very still. "Did you witness it?" "I was in the galley. I heard it." "Did you submit a corroborating statement?" Lena shook her head. "Maya told me not to. She said it would make things worse. And then, 2 months later, Maya got reassigned to the Atlanta-Miami corridor, and she never came back to this route." She looked up. "I kept thinking I should have done something then, and then this morning happened, and I was standing there again, and I just—" She stopped. "You're doing something now," Ava said. Lena blinked. Something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of it. "I need you to give me a formal statement," Ava said. "Everything you just told me, and anything else you remember. It goes into the official record. That means it may be part of a regulatory review. It may be called as evidence." She held Lena's gaze. "It also means it cannot be dismissed in 48 hours. Lena nodded slowly. "Okay. Are you sure?" "Yes." Firmer this time. "Yes, I'm sure." Ava opened a new document on her tablet. "Start from the beginning." 22 rows back, Jordan Ellis had stopped pretending to work. He was fully upright in his seat now, phone in hand. Not the recorder, but his main device, notifications stacking faster than he could clear them. The regional outlet's post about the grounded flight had crossed 1,000 shares. Someone had screenshotted it and posted it on a social platform with the caption, "Anyone know why a pilot apparently refused to fly with his co-pilot this morning at DFW?" That post had been shared 40,000 times in the past 90 minutes. Jordan's editor had texted him twice. He typed back, "I'm on the plane. I have audio. Give me 2 hours." He looked at the closed cockpit door. Then at the jetway door, still sealed. Then back at his phone. He opened his laptop and began writing in earnest. In seat 2B, Walter Drummond had unfolded his hands. He was reading something on his tablet now. Not a brief. A news alert. The same one everyone else with a signal was beginning to see. Horizon Airways flight. Grounded at DFW. Pilot reportedly refuses assignment over co-pilot. The headline was imprecise. The story behind it, Walter suspected, was considerably more precise than anyone outside this aircraft currently understood. He'd spent the morning watching and listening and building a picture from fragments the way he always did, and the picture he had built was not a small one. He made a note in his phone, a name, a flight number, a time. The kind of note a man makes when he thinks he might need it later. He almost certainly would. In the Horizon Airways executive suite in Atlanta, the morning had derailed completely. Gary Lester was standing at the window of the conference room with his phone pressed to his ear, and the expression of a man watching a controlled burn become something else. Around the conference table, 3 other executives sat with laptops open, all of them on separate calls, all of them watching the same numbers climb on the same social media dashboards. "How many outlets have picked it up?" Lester asked. His assistant on the other end, 11 national, as of 8 minutes ago. It's accelerating. Lester closed his eyes briefly. "And FASA, have they confirmed the audit authority?" "Confirmed. Protocol 7 Delta. The aircraft is locked until Brooks signs off." Lester opened his eyes. He looked at the table. The executives around it looked back at him with the expressions of people who needed someone to make a decision and were very glad it wasn't their job. "We need to get ahead of this," someone said. A VP named Carol Marsh, Communications Division. "We issue a statement, proactive. We acknowledge the crew irregularity, and we confirm internal review is underway. We frame it as the system working as intended." "The system working as intended," Lester repeated flatly. "It's messaging, Gary." "The system has been not working as intended for 3 years. The audit is going to show that." Silence around the table. Lester turned back to the window. Below, Atlanta traffic moved in its usual indifferent patterns, a city that had no idea what was happening inside this building. "Get me a line to the FASA regional director," he said, "and find out exactly what Brooks has access to in that audit portal." His assistant, "She has hub-level access. Dallas, 3 years of records." Lester was quiet for a moment. "All of it?" "All of it." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room when everyone in it knows something, and no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Back on the aircraft, Lena had been talking for 18 minutes. She was composed now, past the shaking hand stage, into something steadier. She spoke carefully and in sequence, the way someone speaks when they've been organizing their thoughts for a long time and have finally been given permission to say them out loud. She described the comment Hale had made to Maya 8 months ago. She described 2 other incidents she'd witnessed. One involving a junior male pilot being openly dismissed by Hale in the galley. Another involving Hale instructing a gate agent to reassign a passenger he described, using language that Lena repeated precisely, without flinching. She described this morning every word she'd heard from the corridor, every moment she'd stood with the safety cards against her chest and felt the weight of saying nothing pressing down on her. When she finished, Ava looked at the document on her tablet. It was 4 pages. "Thank you," Ava said. Lena exhaled. "What happens now?" "Now it's part of the official record. It will be reviewed by FASA's compliance team and likely by Aviation Authority investigators if this proceeds to a formal inquiry." Ava paused. "If anyone from the airline contacts you about this statement, anyone, including HR, you are not required to speak with them without independent representation." Lena nodded. "Are they going to try to get me to take it back?" Ava looked at her steadily. "Possibly." "It's your choice what you do if that happens." "I won't," Lena said. "Take it back. I won't." She said it quietly, but with the particular firmness of a person who has spent a long time not saying things and has decided they are done with that. Ava saved the document. "You can return to the cabin. And Lena," she waited until the young woman looked at her, "what you did this morning matters. It's going to matter more than you know. Lena held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, stood, and let herself out. The cockpit door closed. Ava returned to the audit portal. She was cross-referencing a specific set of scheduling records against complaint filing dates, building a timeline that showed, clearly and in sequence, the rotation of crew members away from certain routes following complaint submissions when something stopped her. A folder in the internal system. It should have contained 13 documents based on the filing index. The index listed them. The folder was empty. She checked the system log. The documents had been accessed 40 minutes ago, modified and removed. 40 minutes ago, she'd been in this cockpit, removing Richard Hale from duty. Someone had used that window. She sat back. Her eyes moved across the data without blinking, reading the access log timestamp, the user ID attached to the modification, the routing of the deleted files. The user ID didn't belong to Ground Ops. It didn't belong to the Dallas hub. It routed through a permissions level that only existed at the executive tier. Ava reached for her communications device. It's Brooks. A pause. Someone accessed the internal complaint archive 40 minutes ago and removed 13 documents. The access ID routes to executive-level permissions in Atlanta. Another pause. No, don't flag it yet. Let me confirm the source. She lowered the device. Because I want to know exactly who we're dealing with before we move. She ended the call. She looked at the empty folder on her screen, at the index that still listed 13 files that no longer existed. Then she opened her personal backup drive, a separate encrypted system she carried on her communications device, one that had nothing to do with Horizon Airways' internal infrastructure, and began pulling up documents she had downloaded to it 3 weeks ago, during the initial phase of the audit, before she'd ever boarded this aircraft. She had anticipated this. Not specifically, not this file, this moment, this user ID, but she had audited enough systems to know that when you start pulling on threads, the people holding the other end eventually feel the tug, and some of them cut the thread rather than let you follow it. She'd started pulling copies the moment she'd had hub-level access. Everything that had just been deleted from Horizon's internal system existed in full on her encrypted drive. She set the device down on the console beside her tablet and looked at both screens, the empty folder on one, the intact copies on the other. Then, quietly, to no one. Now I know why I was sent here. It wasn't about Richard Hale. It had never been only about Richard Hale. Hale was the visible part, the behavior that bubbled to the surface when the pressure underneath it got high enough. But what was underneath was older and more deliberate. A network of small decisions made by people with enough authority to make them quietly. Files closed without review, crew members rotated away, complaints logged and buried, and now, when discovery became a real possibility, files actively erased. Someone at the executive level of Horizon Airways had been running this, had been running it for years. Ava opened a new communication window. She composed a message to the FASA regional director. She attached her supplementary review document, Lena's testimony, the timeline she'd built from scheduling records, the access log showing the deletion, and the backup copies of the deleted files. She reviewed it once. Then she attached one more document, the incident report from this morning. Richard Hale. Every word, every timestamp. Or the ATC frequency violation, the statements in front of crew, the refusal to begin pre-flight checks, every second of it, documented and signed. She sent it. Then she composed a second message, this one to a different recipient. The story broke at 9:47 in the morning. Jordan Ellis's piece went live on the outlet's website at 9:44. By 9:47, it had been picked up by 2 national wire services. By 9:52, it was on the homepage of every major news aggregator in the country. By 10:15, it was the lead item on 3 cable news tickers. The headline read, Inside Flight 247, How a Senior Pilot's Refusal Exposed a Deeper Problem at Horizon Airways. It was careful and specific. Jordan was a good journalist. He had the audio from his recorder, not perfect quality, but clear enough. He had his own witness account. On he had the social media trail documenting the 2-hour delay. He had a statement, brief and anonymous, from a source he described only as a current Horizon crew member. He did not have Ava's audit documents. He did not know about FOSSA. He was working from what he'd observed and what he could verify. It was enough. By the time Flight 2247 finally pushed back from Gate D14, 3 hours and 11 minutes after its scheduled departure, with a replacement captain named Owen Barrett in the left seat and Ava Brooks in the right, the story was everywhere. In the cabin, several passengers had already read it. Some of them looked at the cockpit door differently as they settled back into their seats for departure. A few of them, without quite knowing who they were applauding or why, had felt something loosen in their chests when the plane finally began to move. Walter Drummond read the article in full before taxiing had even finished. He read it the way he read everything, carefully, looking for what it said and what it didn't say, what had been documented and what remained, for now, below the surface. When he finished, he put his tablet away. He looked at the cockpit door. Then he opened his phone and sent a message to a colleague in Washington. 3 sentences. His colleague read it, replied in 2 minutes, and the two of them had a brief conversation that would, in about 72 hours, have consequences neither of them could entirely predict. In Atlanta, the Horizon Airways executive suite had moved from crisis management into something that more closely resembled controlled panic. The communications team had issued a statement at 10:08. Horizon Airways is committed to a professional and inclusive workplace and takes all crew concerns seriously. We are conducting an internal review of the events on Flight 2247 and will provide updates as appropriate. It had been drafted in 12 minutes, and it showed. The response on social media was immediate and not kind. Phrases like internal review and as appropriate landed exactly as hollow as they sounded. By 10:30, Lester was in a separate call with Horizon's legal team. He was describing, as carefully as he could, the scope of what FOSSA had access to in the Dallas Hub audit portal. The lead attorney's response, after a long pause, was, "How long has this audit been running?" 4 months. Another pause. "And the compliance protocol, 7 Delta, that gives them authority over the aircraft and crew records?" "Yes." "Gary?" The attorney's voice was measured in the way voices get measured when the person speaking is working very hard not to say what they're actually thinking. If their auditor has hub-level access to 3 years of complaint records and she's been on this for 4 months, there is nothing internal review is going to contain. You understand that? Lester understood that. "We need to get ahead of the narrative," he said, "and we need to know what she has." "You can't ask her what she has. She's a federal auditor." Lester closed his eyes. The call came to Ava's communications device at 11:23. While Flight 2247 was somewhere over Arkansas at 32,000 feet, and the crosswind she'd noted in the pre-flight data had turned out to be exactly where she'd predicted. The number on the screen didn't belong to FOSSA. It didn't belong to Horizon Ops. It routed through the executive permissions tier at Horizon headquarters. She let it ring twice. Then she answered, "Brooks." The voice on the other end was calm and unhurried, which meant it was performing calm and unhurried. She'd heard that particular performance before. "First Officer Brooks, this is Marcus Webb." A pause. Not the Marcus Webb from her training, a different one. A VP of operations named Marcus Webb who had been at Horizon for 14 years. "I'm calling on behalf of the executive team. We want to express our full cooperation with the FOSSA review and to discuss how we might coordinate on next steps." "That conversation goes through FOSSA's regional director," Ava said. "I can give you that contact if you need it." Of course. A breath. "I also wanted to, personally, acknowledge the events of this morning, what you experienced. It's not reflective of who we are as an airline." "It's reflective of 6 years of complaint records," Ava said. "Which I have." Silence. I understand you may have some concerns about I don't have concerns, Ava said. I have documentation. Those are different things. Another silence. Longer. First Officer Brooks. His voice shifted almost imperceptibly, the performance thinning. You've done important work this morning. The review of Captain Hale is clearly warranted. Oh, but there may be context around some of the broader records that isn't immediately apparent from the data alone. We'd want the opportunity to— Mr. Webb, Ava said, 13 files were deleted from the Dallas Hub complaint archive at 7:52 this morning. The access log shows the deletion was authorized through executive-level permissions. I have the originals. She paused. I'd be careful right now about what you characterize as context. The silence this time was absolute. Then, carefully, I see. The FOSSA regional director will be in contact with your legal team by end of business today, Ava said. I'd suggest you have representation ready. She ended the call. She looked at the instrument panel for a moment, at the altitude reading, the airspeed, the horizon line on the attitude indicator, steady and level. Then she looked at the first officer's window, her window, and at the flat, enormous sky beyond it. The call had confirmed something she'd suspected since she'd found the empty folder. Marcus Webb had made that deletion, or authorized it, or known about it and said nothing, which, in the eyes of the regulatory framework she operated under, amounted to the same thing. She added his name to her supplementary review document. He was the 7th. The new headlines began appearing at 1:15 in the afternoon. Not about Richard Hale, about Ava. The first one came from a publication that Ava recognized, a mid-sized business outlet that had, in her experience, a history of covering aviation stories from the angle most favorable to the industry. The headline read, Questions arise about FOSSA auditors' methods on Horizon flight. The story was thin. It referenced unnamed sources describing the audit as disruptive and suggesting that the extended grounding of Flight 2247 had created cascading delays that affected nearly 800 other passengers across 3 connecting routes. It quoted, anonymously, someone described as a senior industry figure, questioning whether embedding auditors in active crew positions created inherent conflicts of interest. It didn't name Ava, but it didn't need to. The description was specific enough. By 2 o'clock, 2 more pieces had appeared. One questioned the legality of recording crew communications during an embedded audit, a question that had a clear legal answer Ava could have provided in 1 sentence, but that was not the point of the question. On the other surfaced what it described as a controversial decision Ava had made during a previous audit 2 years earlier, a finding that had grounded a regional carrier's fleet for 11 days pending safety review. The decision had been correct. The grounding had been upheld by the FAA on review. The fleet had returned to service with 17 documented safety improvements. None of that was in the article. In her hotel room in Chicago, Flight 2247 had landed at O'Hare at 12:41. 43 minutes late, but otherwise unremarkable. Ava sat at the desk with her laptop open and read each piece carefully, the way she read everything. Looking for the architecture, who had been talked to, what had been provided and by whom, what the angle was and where it originated. The architecture was clear enough. Someone had made calls. Someone had provided framing, someone with enough industry access to reach multiple publications within a 4-hour window and enough motivation to do it quickly. Her phone rang, a number she recognized. I saw it, she said before the caller could speak. Jordan Ellis's voice. I wanted to give you a heads up. My editor is getting calls, people trying to find inconsistencies in my piece. Someone's pushing back hard. I know. Do you have any comment you want on record? For a follow-up? Ava was quiet for a moment. She looked at her laptop screen, at the headline asking questions about her methods, at the careful, deliberate architecture of the counterattack that had been assembled in 4 hours by people who had been protecting a broken system for years. "Not yet," she said. "But soon." "How soon?" "Give me until tomorrow morning." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the hotel room. Outside, Chicago traffic moved in its familiar patterns. Somewhere in this city, Walter Drummond was presumably in his office. Somewhere in Atlanta, Marcus Webb was on the phone with lawyers. Somewhere in Dallas, a gate agent had taken down the departure board for Flight 2247 and replaced it with a new listing for the following day. And somewhere, she didn't know where, Richard Hale was sitting with the weight of the morning settling over him like weather. She opened her encrypted drive. She had everything, every complaint, every scheduling pattern, every closed file, every deletion log, the entire architecture of a system that had been maintained carefully and deliberately for at least 6 years. She had Lena's testimony. She had her own incident report. She had the access log with Marcus Webb's user ID attached to the 752 deletion. She had it all in triplicate, on the drive, in the FOSSA secure server, and in one additional location that she had arranged quietly in the 40 minutes between Lena leaving the cockpit and Owen Barrett arriving to take the left seat. She had sent a full encrypted copy of everything to 3 recipients: the FASA Regional Director, the FAA's Office of Civil Rights, and a senior investigative reporter at a national publication who had been covering airline safety culture for 11 years and who had, 6 months ago, sent Ava a message through a professional contact saying she was looking for a source who understood the inside of the system. Ava hadn't responded then. She responded now. She opened her laptop and composed a brief email. She attached the encrypted file. She wrote 4 sentences explaining what it contained and what she could verify personally. She did not write her name in the body of the email. She didn't need to. The sender address was enough. She hit send. Then she closed the laptop and sat back. The counterattack had been fast and coordinated, and, in a different situation, might have been enough. But it had been built on the assumption that she was alone, that the documentation was contained, that the people running the narrative had more reach than the person carrying the evidence. They didn't. "Now it's out of their hands," she said quietly. She meant it for the room, for herself, for the accumulated weight of every morning that had looked like this one, every cockpit, every corridor, every dismissal and quiet erasure and 48-hour file closure. She meant it for Maya, whoever and wherever Maya was now. For Lena, on a flight somewhere, carrying the steadiness she'd found in the cockpit that morning. For every complaint that had been stamped "no further action required" by a man named Brian Coulter in a Dallas hub office. She meant it for all of it. Then she stood, moved to the window, and looked out at Chicago spreading wide and lit and indifferent beneath the afternoon sky. Tomorrow, she had work to do. The formal inquiry was announced on a Tuesday. 9 days had passed since Flight 2247 had sat motionless at Gate D14 while the morning shifted around it. 9 days during which the story had moved through its predictable stages: the initial explosion, the corporate statement, the counter-narrative. The think pieces, the cable news panels, the social media cycles that compressed outrage and then boredom into 48-hour windows. But underneath all of that, quieter and more consequential, other things had been moving. The Federal Aviation Safety Authority issued its formal statement at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning Eastern Time. It was 3 paragraphs. It confirmed that a compliance audit of Horizon Airways' Dallas hub operations had been underway for 4 months. It confirmed that the events of Flight 2247 had generated a formal incident report under FOSSA Protocol 7 Delta. It confirmed that the scope of the inquiry had expanded beyond the initial incident to include crew management practices, complaint handling procedures, and internal record-keeping across the Dallas hub. The third paragraph noted that the inquiry had been referred jointly to the FAA's Office of Civil Rights and to the Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General. That third paragraph was the one that changed everything, because the OIG didn't investigate individual pilots. It investigated systems. It investigated organizations. It had subpoena authority, document preservation orders, and a mandate that extended considerably further than any internal airline review ever could. By noon on Tuesday, Horizon Airways stock had dropped 6%. By Thursday, it had dropped another 4%. The airline's legal team, which had spent the previous 9 days preparing for a FASA compliance review, was now preparing for something considerably larger and considerably less containable. In Atlanta, the executive suite had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when the people inside it have stopped performing confidence and are simply waiting to find out how bad it is going to get. Gary Lester had retained personal legal counsel on day 3. He had not made any public statements. He arrived at the office each morning at the same time and left at the same time, and in between, he sat in meetings that had stopped being productive and started being exercises in collective anxiety management. Marcus Webb had lasted 6 days. His resignation was announced in a brief internal memo on the 7th day. The memo cited personal reasons. No one in the building believed the personal reasons. The memo was leaked to Jordan Ellis within 4 hours of its distribution, which suggested that the building itself had reached a consensus about Marcus Webb and had decided that distance was the appropriate response. Jordan published the memo with a single sentence of context. Webb's resignation comes as investigators examine executive-level access to complaint records that were deleted hours after Flight 2247 was grounded. That sentence was the result of 9 days of careful reporting. Jordan had the access log. He had the timestamp. He had the user ID. He had, from a source he would not name, confirmation that the deleted files had been recovered by FASA auditors from a backup source. He did not know that the backup source was Ava Brooks's encrypted drive. He didn't need to know that. What he knew was enough. The story ran on page 1. Richard Hale held a press conference on day 8. But he stood outside a hotel conference room in Dallas with his attorney on one side and his wife on the other, and he read from a prepared statement. He looked older than he had in the cockpit 9 days ago. The particular authority he'd carried in his posture, that 31-year accumulation of unchallenged confidence, had been replaced by something more careful and much smaller. He said that he had concerns about crew readiness that he had expressed through appropriate channels. He said that his record of service spoke for itself. He said that he had never in his career acted with discriminatory intent, and that the characterization of his conduct had been unfair and misleading. He did not take questions. Inside the hotel, watching a feed of the press conference on a laptop, Jordan Ellis noted 3 things. Hale had not denied the specific statements attributed to him in the incident report. He had not addressed the ATC frequency request, and he had not mentioned Frank Patterson. Jordan published his follow-up piece 40 minutes after the press conference ended. It ran the full text of Hale's statement alongside the specific documented incidents from Ava's report, laid out in parallel columns so that readers could see, with precision, what had been said and what had not been addressed. The piece was shared 200,000 times in 12 hours. By the end of day 8, the FAA had suspended Hale's commercial pilot license pending the outcome of the inquiry. It was a preliminary measure, not a final finding. But it was public, and in an industry where a license is everything, public suspension is its own kind of verdict. Hale's attorney issued a statement calling the suspension premature and politically motivated. Nobody paid much attention to the statement. The hearing room in Washington was smaller than most people imagined when they thought about federal hearings. It was on the 4th floor of a government building 12 blocks from the Capitol, with fluorescent lighting and a long table at the front, and rows of chairs arranged in the kind of careful order that suggested someone had spent time making the room look serious. Lena Washington sat in the third row on the left side in a dark blazer she had bought specifically for this occasion, with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight. She had flown in the night before on her own time and her own money, and her supervisor at Horizon had called her twice. She had not returned either call. The hearing was a preliminary session, an evidence review technically, not a full congressional inquiry. But it had attracted enough attention that the gallery behind the witness table was full, and there were cameras in the hallway outside. Lena was the third witness called. She walked to the table and sat down, and adjusted the microphone and looked at the panel of investigators across from her. There were 5 of them. She had been told their names and their roles, but in the moment she looked at them simply as 5 people who were about to hear what she had to say. She said it. She spoke for 22 minutes without notes. She covered the Maya incident, the comment she'd overheard 8 months earlier, the 2 other incidents she'd described in the cockpit to Ava. She described the morning of Flight 2247 in sequence, from the moment she'd first heard raised voices through the cockpit door to the moment she'd sat across from Ava and finally said the thing she'd been carrying for 2 years. Her voice shook once, near the beginning, when she described the feeling of standing in the corridor with the safety cards against her chest and choosing silence. She steadied it herself without pausing and kept going. When she finished, the lead investigator looked at her for a moment before asking the first question. "Ms. Washington," he said, "in your experience on the Dallas-Chicago route, and I want to be precise here, did you ever observe complaints being actively discouraged? Not just ignored, but discouraged?" Lena thought about it. About the small conversations in the galley, the sideways comments, the way certain names were said in certain tones, the way Maya had told her not to submit a corroborating statement, and the particular weariness in Maya's voice when she'd said it, not resignation, but the exhaustion of someone who had already learned what happened when you pushed. "Yes," Lena said. "I did." The investigator wrote something down. The room was very quiet. In the gallery, 3 rows back, Walter Drummond sat with his hands folded and listened. Walter had been contacted by the OIG on day 4. They had found his name in the flight manifest, noted his occupation, and called him as a potential witness to the events on the aircraft. He had agreed immediately without consulting anyone because it had never occurred to him to do otherwise. He gave his account in a private session 2 days before the hearing. He was precise and detailed in the way that 30 years of legal practice had made automatic times, statements, observed behaviors, the sequence of events as he had witnessed them from Seat 2B. He noted the specific moment Hale had walked through the first-class cabin with his flight bag. He noted the expressions on the faces of the crew members who had watched him go. At the end of the session, the investigator had said, "Mr. Drummond, is there anything else you think we should know?" Walter had considered the question. "I've spent my career in rooms where powerful people make decisions about who gets protected and who doesn't," he said. "What I saw on that aircraft was a system being used exactly as it was designed, to protect one kind of person at the expense of another. The pilot was the visible part. The system was the problem." He paused. "That's what you should be looking at." The investigator had written that down too. On the morning of the hearing, before she was called to testify, Ava sat in a small waiting room 2 doors down from the hearing chamber and drank black coffee from a paper cup and read through her prepared statement for the last time. She had been asked to testify in her capacity as the lead auditor on the Horizon Airways Dallas Hub review. She was not testifying as a victim. She was testifying as a federal official presenting findings. That distinction mattered to her, not because she wanted to minimize what had happened in the cockpit, but because she understood that her testimony would carry the most weight when it was grounded in documentation rather than experience. She had documentation. The compiled audit findings ran to 214 pages. They covered 41 complaints, 22 improper closures, 11 pilots implicated in patterns of conduct, 6 years of scheduling irregularities, 1 executive deletion of evidence, and 1 incident on a Tuesday morning in Dallas that had, in the compressed and sometimes random way that history moves, become the point where the accumulated weight of all of it finally broke through the surface. She closed the statement and set it on the chair beside her. She thought about Marcus Webb's phone call on the aircraft, about the way his voice had performed calm while everything underneath it was scrambling. About Gary Lester standing at his Atlanta window watching the numbers climb. About Richard Hale reading from a prepared statement outside a Dallas hotel while his wife stood beside him with an expression that revealed nothing. She thought about Brian Coulter in his Dallas hub office, stamping complaints closed in 48 hours, year after year, because someone with enough authority had decided that was simpler than addressing them. She thought about Lena. The door opened. An aide looked in. "They're ready for you." Ava stood. She straightened her jacket. She picked up her statement and her audit documentation, and she walked into the hearing room and sat down at the witness table and adjusted the microphone and looked at the 5 people across from her. She testified for 1 hour and 40 minutes. When she was finished, the lead investigator thanked her, and the room sat in a silence that had a different quality than the silence at the beginning, heavier, more specific, the silence of people who have just been given the full shape of something they had previously only seen parts of. Then someone in the gallery began to applaud. It started quietly. 2 or 3 people, then more. Then enough that the lead investigator had to tap his gavel once to restore order, not with any real authority, but more as a formality, a gesture toward the structure of the proceeding. Ava gathered her documents. She did not look at the gallery. She was not performing for the gallery. She was doing her job, and her job was nearly done. She found Hale in the corridor outside, an hour after the hearing had ended. She hadn't planned it. He was standing near the elevator bank with his attorney, who had stepped away to take a call, and they were simply, for a moment, in the same narrow hallway with nowhere else to be. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had aged in 9 days in the way that people age when the structures they've relied on begin to fail. Not in obvious ways, but in the quality of stillness around the eyes, the absence of the particular tension that confident people carry without knowing they carry it. "You ruined everything," he said. His voice was quiet. There was no anger in it anymore, which somehow made it worse. Just a flat, tired statement that sounded like something he'd been saying to himself for 9 days. "My career, my reputation, everything I built." Ava looked at him for a moment. "You did," she said. "I just didn't hide it." She held his gaze for 1 more second. Then she walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood waiting with her documents under her arm and her jacket straight and her posture exactly as it had been every moment since she'd walked into that cockpit 9 days ago. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The doors closed. 2 weeks after the hearing, the Aviation Authority issued its preliminary findings. They were not mild. Horizon Airways was placed under enhanced operational oversight for a period of 18 months. 6 pilots, including Hale, faced formal certification reviews. Brian Coulter was terminated and referred to the OIG for potential obstruction charges. The complaint handling process for the entire Dallas hub was suspended and replaced with a federally supervised system. And 4 other domestic carriers, having watched what the inquiry had uncovered, quietly contacted FASA to request voluntary compliance reviews before anyone came looking. The industry had not been unaware of these problems. It had been aware in the way that large systems are aware of the things they have decided are too expensive to fix. What changed was not the awareness. What changed was the calculation. The cost of not fixing it had just become considerably higher than the cost of fixing it. Lena received a letter from Horizon Airways' new interim management team. It acknowledged her testimony, confirmed her position was secure, and noted that her conduct throughout the inquiry had been consistent with the highest standards of professional integrity. She read it twice. Then she framed it. Not because she needed the validation, she was past needing it from them, but because she'd promised herself somewhere on a flight back from Washington that she would mark the moments that cost something. This one had cost something. She hung it on the wall. 4 weeks after Flight 2247. The Horizon Airways Dallas hub at 6 in the morning looked the same as it always had, from the outside. Same gates, same departure boards, scrolling the same city names in the same clean font. Same smell of coffee and recycled air and jet fuel coming in through the loading doors whenever they opened. Same quality of light. That particular pre-dawn gray that belongs specifically to airport terminals, as if they exist in their own time zone somewhere between night and day. But inside the operations center, things were different. The new crew management system had been running for 11 days. Complaints now went to a federally supervised review board rather than to a hub coordinator with close relationships to senior pilots. Scheduling decisions were logged with documented rationale. Nothing moved without a paper trail. Brian Coulter's office was occupied by an interim compliance officer named Patricia Reed, who had come in from the OIG's office and who had, in 11 days, already reviewed the backlog of the closed complaints Ava's audit had flagged. She had reopened 9 of them. 3 had already resulted in formal findings. Patricia was at her desk at 5:47 when the crew manifest for Flight 2247's reinstatement came through. The route had been cleared to resume service under the new oversight structure. She scanned the crew list. Everything was in order. She initialed the clearance and moved on to the next file. At Gate D14, Ava arrived at 5:55, not as First Officer Brooks, not as Senior Auditor Brooks, as Captain Brooks. The promotion had been offered 2 weeks after the hearing by a new acting executive at Horizon, who had been brought in as part of the restructuring and who had reviewed Ava's record. The full record, not the sanitized version, not the version that had existed in proximity to Hale's network, and had made the decision in about 40 minutes. He'd called her personally. He'd kept the call brief. He'd said, "You've earned this. I'm sorry it took this long." She'd accepted without ceremony. She walked through the terminal in her captain's uniform, the 4 stripes on the sleeve. The wings in their correct position, with her flight bag over one shoulder and her tablet in her hand, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who has somewhere to be and knows exactly how to get there. She didn't announce herself. There was no committee, no reception, no one lined up at the gate to mark the occasion. The gate agent glanced at her ID, nodded, and waved her through. The jetway was dim and slightly cold, the way jetways always are before the day gets going. She stepped onto the aircraft. The cabin crew was already aboard. 3 of them moved through the forward section, running through their own pre-departure checks. Beverage carts, safety cards, overhead bin latches, the 100 small tasks that happen before passengers arrive and that passengers never see. They looked up when the cockpit door opened. The first officer, a man named Daniel Park, mid-30s, calm-eyed, with the particular ease of a pilot who is comfortable in his own competence, was already in the right seat running system checks. He looked up when she came in. "Good morning, Captain." "Good morning." She set her bag down, settled into the left seat, pulled the seatbelt across her lap. She looked at the instrument panel, the hydraulic readings, the fuel load, the navigation system already pulling in weather data for the Chicago corridor. She picked up the pre-flight checklist, and then the forward galley door opened and Lena stepped in. She looked different than she had 4 weeks ago. Not in the obvious ways, same face, same uniform, but in the way she held herself. The apologetic quality that had been in her posture on the morning of the original flight, but the sense of someone bracing for something was gone. She stood straight. She looked directly at Ava without the careful sideways quality of someone trying to gauge how much space they're allowed to take up. "Captain Brooks," she said. There was something in the way she said the title. Not surprised, not performative, just right, like a fact that had always been true and was simply now being stated correctly. "Lena," Ava looked at her. "How are you?" "Good," Lena said, and she meant it, which Ava could tell because she said it simply, without the automatic reassuring inflation people put into the word when they don't mean it. "Really good." "I'm glad." Ava turned back to the checklist. "Let's have a clean flight." "Yes, Captain." Lena returned to the cabin. Daniel glanced at Ava from the right seat. She was already working through the checklist: hydraulic system, fuel system, electrical, avionics, moving through it with the same methodical precision she'd always brought to it in every cockpit, on every morning, regardless of who was watching or not watching. No one was making it difficult this morning. That was the difference. Not the checklist itself. The checklist was the same. Not the aircraft. It was the same 737 series she'd been flying for 4 years. The difference was simply the absence of resistance. The morning without friction. The job allowed to be just the job. It was remarkable how much lighter that felt. Boarding began at 6:20. Passengers filed in with their usual mix of expressions: the tired, the impatient, the already resigned, the few who actually seemed pleased to be going somewhere. Bags went up. Laptops came out. The particular choreography of a full commercial cabin settling into itself. In seat 2B, a familiar face. Walter Drummond placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment and settled into the aisle seat with the ease of a frequent flyer who has long since stopped thinking about the mechanics of it. He pulled out his tablet. He opened a document he'd been reviewing for the past 2 days, a brief relevant to a case in Chicago that had nothing to do with Horizon Airways. Then he glanced at the cockpit door, which was closed. He looked at the closed door for a moment. Then, quietly to himself, he allowed a small smile that nobody around him would have noticed and nobody around him needed to notice. He opened his brief and got back to work. At 6:38, a man in seat 14C, who had been on the original Flight 2247, a marketing director named Scott Fuller, who had filed a complaint with Horizon's customer service about the delay and received a travel voucher in response, looked around the cabin with a vague sense of recognition he couldn't quite place. He didn't know why this gate, this aircraft, felt familiar. He put his headphones on and looked out the window. At 6:41, the cockpit door opened briefly, and Ava's voice came over the cabin speakers. "Good morning. This is Captain Brooks. On behalf of myself and First Officer Park and our crew, welcome aboard Horizon Airways, Flight 2247 to Chicago O'Hare. We're looking at a smooth morning ahead. Light winds, clear skies, and an on-time departure. Sit back and let us take care of the rest." She released the intercom button. In the cabin, Lena moved through the rows with the pre-departure safety demonstration, calm and precise, her voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. In seat 2B, Walter Drummond looked up from his brief for a moment when he heard the name. Captain Brooks. He looked at the cockpit door, then back at his brief. The small smile returned. He let it stay a little longer this time. At 6:53, the jetway detached. At 6:57, ground control cleared Flight 2247 to taxi to runway 17 left. Ava acknowledged the clearance, released the parking brake, and felt the aircraft begin to move with the particular unhurried deliberateness of 200,000 pounds of aluminum and fuel and human life finding its direction. She had sat in the right seat of this aircraft on a morning that had started like any other morning and had become something else entirely. She had documented and testified and held the line through every attempt to move her off it. She had done all of it, and now she was doing this. The runway stretched ahead, long and flat and clear, with the early Dallas sun casting a low golden light across the tarmac that made everything look for a moment like the beginning of something. She looked at the instrument panel. Everything was where it should be. Airspeed, altitude, Attitude indicator showing straight and level. Daniel ran through the final checks beside her, efficient and easy, and called out each confirmation as it came. She looked through the windshield at the runway ahead. She thought about Marcus Webb and his careful, outperforming voice, about Gary Lester at his window, about a folder that had been emptied and an encrypted drive that had not, about a young flight attendant standing in a corridor with safety cards pressed to her chest, finding her courage in increments, and then, when it mattered, all at once. She thought about the left seat, about sitting in it for the first time this morning and feeling not triumph. She hadn't expected triumph and she didn't feel it, but something quieter and more durable. The simple, solid weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Ground control handed them off to Tower. Tower cleared them for takeoff. Ava advanced the throttles. The engines built to their climb setting and the aircraft began to move, slowly at first and then faster, the runway markings blurring beneath them. The airspeed indicator climbing through 80, 90, 100 knots, and then she pulled back on the controls with the steady, certain pressure of someone who has done this 1,000 times and will do it 1,000 more. The nose lifted, the wheels left the ground, and Flight 2247 climbed into the open sky, clean and smooth and completely without drama, the way it was always supposed to go. And beneath them, Dallas fell away, and the horizon opened up wide and blue, and the altitude indicator climbed, and the city shrank, and the sky got larger and larger until there was nothing ahead of them but clear air, and Chicago, waiting at the other end. Ava leveled off at cruise altitude. She checked the instruments. She looked at the horizon line. Steady, unbroken, exactly where it should be. She let out one slow, quiet breath. Beside her, Daniel completed the cruise checklist and sat back. The autopilot was engaged. The sky was clear. There was nothing to do for a while except watch and be ready, which was, in its way, the whole job. He glanced at her briefly. She was looking straight ahead, both hands resting lightly on her knees. Posture straight, shoulders level, unhurried, the same as she'd always been. She thought, not for the first time and not for the last, respect isn't given in this job. It's proven every day. She had proven it. She would prove it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day after that. Not because she had to, not because the proof was demanded of her in ways it was never demanded of others, though it was, and had been, and likely would be again, but because that was who she was, because the proof was in the work itself. And in the checklist, run clean and the instruments read correctly, and the passengers delivered safely from one place to another. In doing the job. She looked at the horizon ahead, wide, open, clear, hers. How many people in positions of power are still making decisions about who belongs and who gets to stay silent about it? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more stories that don't flinch from the truth.